Hello and welcome to the I Can Do podcast with Benjamin Lee. We're here to talk about tips and strategies to have an I Can Do mindset when it comes to faith, family, fitness, and food. Let's go. Here's your host, Benjamin Lee.
There is a passage in Daniel chapter 1 where we read about a young man by the name of Daniel. Daniel was taken into exile to Babylon in the days of Israel. And what we find here in Daniel chapter 1 is that Daniel was a young man who knew where he was headed. Daniel had his mind made up that no matter where he would be in life, that he was going to serve God. I love what it says in Daniel chapter 1, where Daniel is actually having a conversation, and there's a lot on the line when it came to his livelihood and how things are going to work out. He is a prisoner. He's in exile in Babylon, and he's in this whole new world. And so how do we respond when we find ourselves in difficult situations? It can be very easy for us to kind of waver and to be tossed to and fro. And that could have happened with Daniel, but we see that it did not. In Daniel chapter 1 and verse 5, it says, the king appointed for them a daily ration from the king's choice food and from the wine which he drank, and appointed that they should be educated 3 years, at the end of which they were to enter the king's personal service. And so you have these boys with Daniel, whose names are going to be changed to these Babylonian names, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Now, listen to what the Bible says in verse 8 of Daniel chapter 1. But Daniel made up his mind that he would not defile himself with the king's choice food or with the wine which he drank. So he sought permission from the commander of the officials that he might not defile himself. I want you to think about what Daniel said. He made up his mind. That's what I want us to think about here just for a moment. Make up your mind. I need to make up my mind. And when I make up my mind that this is the path that I'm going to go on with respect to serving God or how I'm going to respond to certain situations, it changes everything. Make up your mind. Daniel had this mindset, and by the way, it would work out well for him at the end of Daniel chapter 1 and really throughout his life. There's another example in Daniel chapter 6, where in Daniel chapter 6, Daniel, he's just risen to the top with his responsibilities, with what's going on, where he is in Babylon. He had made up his mind that I'm going to follow God and trust in him, and we'll see what happens. And so he kept continuing to trust in God. And so by the time we get to chapter 6, people are looking for ways to catch him, but there's nothing that they could accuse him of. And so what they try to do then, they try to go after his faith and say, okay, let's try to get him in trouble through his faith. And so it said in verse number 5 of Daniel chapter 6, then these men said, we will not find any ground of accusation against this Daniel, unless we find it against him with regard to the law of his God. And so they set something up in place where they knew that Daniel was praying 3 times a day, and they put some law in place where he could no longer do that, or at least he was not supposed to do that. I want you to hear the response of Daniel. The Bible says in verse number 11, then these men came by agreement and found Daniel making petition and supplication before his God. It's the idea that he was praying. Then they approached and spoke before the king about the king's injunction. Did you not sign an injunction that any man who makes a petition to any god or man besides you, O king, for 30 days is to be cast into the lion's den? The king replied, the statement is true, according to the law of the Medes and Persians, which may not be revoked. Then they answered and spoke before the king, Daniel, who was one of the exiles from Judah, pays no attention to you. I love that because he didn't care. He had already made up his mind on the path that he was going to take. So they said, he pays no attention to you, O king, or to the injunction which you signed, but keeps making his petition 3 times a day. In other words, he's continuing to pray 3 times a day. Then, as soon as the king heard this statement, he was deeply distressed and set his mind on delivering Daniel. And even until sunset, he kept exerting himself to rescue him. So I want you to notice here that Daniel, he didn't care. He just said he's not worried about that. And he would just continue to pray to God in the same manner that he had already been doing. So his mind was already made up. You go back to verse 10, it says, now when Daniel knew that the document was signed, he entered his house. Now in his roof chamber, he had windows open toward Jerusalem. And he continued kneeling on his knees 3 times a day, praying and giving thanks before his God as he had been doing previously. That's what it looks like when we make up our mind. There's no deviation. We know who we are. We know the path that we're on. That's the path we're going to take. So I want you to think about this for a moment. Make up your mind. Maybe it's with your faith. Maybe it's with your exercise regimen. If you know that this is something you need to do, make up your mind and do it. Don't allow things to get in the way. We talk about how family is important. Well, let's make up our mind to make sure that family always stays a priority. There will be distractions. There will be obstacles, but the obstacle is always the way. And truthfully, I think, or the more I'm thinking, when our mind is made up, choices become that much more easier because we already know what the choice is going to be. So we don't even have to deliberate. We don't even have to figure out which way we're going to go. It just becomes so much easier. There's clarity. So maybe you find yourself struggling, going back and forth, starting something, then stopping, taking 1 step forward and 2 steps back. I'm wondering, is it because you haven't fully made up your mind? You see, when we make up our mind or make up our minds, everything changes. We know our North Star. We know who we are. We know our identity. We know the path that we're going to take. That's the power of making up our minds. It doesn't matter where you may be. It doesn't matter whether it's through a pandemic, job loss, family issues, health scares. When our mind is made up, everything becomes easier. Make up your mind and watch what happens. Take care and God bless.